What if the most terrifying killer of the 1980s wasn't hiding in a dark alley, but in a quiet London apartment, smiling at his neighbors? Tonight, we're uncovering the horrifying truth about Dennis Nilsen, a man who seemed ordinary, yet lived among piles of unspeakable secrets hidden beneath his very floorboards. How did his neighbors not know? How did authorities miss the clues? And most chilling of all, what does it mean when pure evil blends so seamlessly into everyday life? By the end of this story, you'll never look at that friendly neighbor the same way again. How could someone living just a floor below you hide such horror without you ever noticing? That question feels impossible until you look at the life Dennis Nilsen presented to the world. On the surface, he came across as almost painfully average. He worked at a job center, helping people with benefits and employment support. In the building where he lived, he wasn't remembered as loud or difficult. He would nod hello, exchange the usual polite words, and sometimes even stop for a brief chat. For at least one or two neighbors, he would invite them in for tea. The kind of small gesture that makes someone appear trustworthy, even friendly. No one looking at his life from the outside had reason to suspect that anything more sinister was going on than the everyday struggles of a reserved man living alone in London. The truth was, that ordinariness was his greatest disguise. The apartment building's narrow stairwells were filled with the same chipped paint, the same bland walls you could find in hundreds of other flats across the city. Neighbors passed each other hauling groceries, carrying laundry bags, or rushing off to work. They nodded, muttered greetings, and returned to their private spaces. Life in a shared building often depends on surface-level civility. No one digs too deep into the lives behind each door. Nilsen thrived in that environment. His capacity to blend was never about charm, but about never standing out. And yet, looking back, the signs of something terribly wrong were always there. There had been persistent smells that crept through the hallways and seeped into flats above and beside his. At first, people chalked it up to the building itself. Old pipes, poor ventilation, maybe someone leaving garbage rotting too long in a bin. The human mind tends to look for the simplest explanation rather than the horrifying one. So, tenants comforted themselves with the belief that it was just part of city living. The landlords were called more than once for plumbing repairs. And when water pressure dropped or drains clogged, residents cursed the brickwork and went back to daily life. Even when these problems repeated, few people linked them to the quiet man they saw each day on the stairs. Think about that. An unnatural stench lingering in the air, blocking you from cooking or relaxing. And yet no one raised their voice loud enough to demand, really demand, that something be done. One tenant later explained that they assumed the smell came from dead rodents sitting in the walls. Others joked about London flats being cursed with bad pipes, as though this was some unavoidable flaw of urban living. That casual dismissal was exactly the space Nilsen needed to operate. He counted on people telling themselves tidy little stories that explained away the discomfort. But more than anything, it was his withdrawn life that encouraged that blind spot. Nilsen wasn't inviting large groups into his home or making scenes in the building. He would mention his dog or give some polite excuse about being busy, and that was the end of it. In most communities, especially in crowded cities, privacy is respected almost to a fault. Live and let live quickly turns into a wall of silence that protects not just ordinary people, but also those carrying dark secrets. What makes this detail unsettling is how it shows the narrow margin between suspicion and complacency. If just one person had pushed harder, if one neighbor had said, "No, that smell isn't normal," the story might have ended far earlier. But instead, dozens of families carried on with their lives, going up and down those stairs, passing the apartment, and never realizing that inside was a nightmare concealed just beneath their feet. Imagine walking across your own carpet, and just beneath the boards are layers hiding something you could not comprehend. That was the chilling reality Nilsen lived with every day, closing his door and presenting himself to the world as nothing more remarkable than the quiet man one floor down. His survival relied on appearances, on neighbors too polite or too distracted to dig deeper. And while the mystery of the smells and the plumbing lingered, nobody truly considered opening his door. Behind it, something far darker waited for discovery. Something that the everyday politeness between neighbors had kept hidden in plain sight. What really happened once those doors shut behind Dennis Nilsen's guests? That's the part that makes this story nearly unbearable. To neighbors, he was simply the man one floor down. But to the men he brought inside, his home was a trap designed with care. He didn't snatch people off the street or drag them in kicking and screaming. Instead, he extended offers: food, alcohol, sometimes even a spare bed for the night. Many of the men he targeted were vulnerable. Runaways, men without stable homes, or those who thought they'd found a moment of kindness from a stranger. When life on the streets leaves you hungry and exhausted, an invitation like that feels like a lifeline. That lifeline, in Nilsen's case, came with a price that none of them imagined. The terrifying part isn't the sheer violence, but the ordinary steps leading up to it. Picture this. You're sitting in his living room, a pint in front of you, the smell of cooking drifting from the kitchen. Maybe he puts on music or talks about his dog. On the surface, he played the role of a host, and a fairly unimaginative one at that. There was no dramatic sense of danger. It all unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, as a person came to feel safe in what they thought was a stranger's generosity. Once that trust hardened, shifting into manipulation came easily. His confidence lay in his ability to mask an agenda under the dull rituals of an evening drink or small talk about the weather. That's where the danger hid, not in the loud or obvious signs of a predator, but in the quiet normality. Descriptions of his apartment from that time make the contrast even worse. At first glance, it appeared tidy, nothing unusual. A small flat with the usual bland furniture and a handful of personal touches. There were no dramatic stains or glaring signs of what occurred there. Yet behind that neat exterior, it was already layered with secrets. He arranged rooms to hide the evidence of what he did. And by the time anyone noticed, the damage had been done. For the men who stayed, what began as a drink or a casual visit became the final step into a controlled environment where every detail worked against them. When you study the way predators operate, the patterns are chillingly consistent. They look for the overlooked, those who won't be missed right away. They learn to read desperation the way others read a newspaper. That was Nilsen's tool of choice. Alcohol made people slower, easier to convince, and easier to overpower. Once he had someone in that fog, or believing they could put their guard down, his method shifted from hospitality to cold procedure. Nothing rushed, nothing chaotic. By all accounts, he worked in silence, deliberately, as though following a private checklist. This wasn't explosive violence, but a methodical process that repeated over and over again. That repetition turned his apartment into something worse than a crime scene. It became an assembly line, one that produced death with the same dull rhythm as someone following a daily routine. What makes it so disturbing is how easily everyday life blended with that process. A place designed for cooking, sleeping, and watching television became a hunting ground. Every room in that apartment supported his pattern, whether it was the living room where lures began, or the tighter spaces used afterward to conceal the reality of what had happened. It was transformation in plain sight. A home shifting into a cage the moment the door locked. That's why descriptions often mention silence. Once a victim stopped fighting, the quiet carried on. Neighbors above might hear nothing more than the muffled sounds of conversation, then total stillness, and later, the faint buzz of the radio. When hiding places ran out, Nilsen turned his flat into storage. Loose floorboards, cupboards, corners, he used whatever he could. Those decisions had consequences. A sour, persistent smell that seeped through walls and ceilings. Neighbors blamed pipes or rodents. They went on with their lives above the secret. Keeping bodies in a living space is more than concealment. For Nilsen, it became possession. Accounts suggest he revisited and arranged remains. Behavior experts later linked to necrophilic compulsions. That blurred line between disposal and possession meant the apartment stopped being a neutral place. It became an extension of the crimes, a private world where the dead remained a fixture. The breakthrough came from something mundane. Clogged drains. Tenants complained of slow sinks and foul-smelling gunk. Plumbers arrived expecting grease and hair. Instead, their rods pulled out tissue and fragments that didn't behave like food waste. Small bones wedged at pipe joints. The smell was unmistakable to anyone familiar with decomposition. As more material accumulated, the drainage system could no longer hide what was being put into it. The plumbers collected samples and handed them to police. Forensics confirmed the worst: human tissue and bone. In a single chain of plumbing repairs, the evidence that had been stored under floorboards and in cupboards found its way into the open. Nilsen watched some of those repairs with the same polite composure he used daily. He complained about the drains alongside his neighbors, even as workers removed the very proof of his crimes. That calmness, standing above men who were handling human remains and acting like an ordinary tenant, is one of the most disturbing details in this case. When police finally confronted Nilsen, they expected panic or denial. Instead, they found a man disturbingly calm, almost relieved. He spoke freely and without apparent remorse, walking investigators through evenings and encounters with a clinical detachment. Psychologists who later reviewed him noted deep emotional detachment and a need for control. He discussed murders as if recounting mundane events. That nonchalance forced investigators into a grim realization. The number of victims might be far larger than the remains suggested. Nilsen shrugged off precise counts as if they didn't matter. Hearing someone list killings with such casualness destroyed the comforting idea that monstrous acts always feel monstrous to the person who committed them. Why does Nilsen's story unsettle more than killers who lurk in obvious danger spots? Because he looked harmless. He rode the bus, worked a steady job, bought groceries. He wore normal clothes and practiced normal routines. Predators like that avoid attention by being ordinary. They don't need charisma. They need to be boring enough to be ignored. We trade safety for polite distance in cities. We nod on stairs, help carry shopping, then close our doors. Mutual respect becomes mutual blindness. Nilsen exploited that silence. He wasn't a shadowy movie villain. He was the neighbor with a dog and a polite nod. That reality forces a hard question. How many people with frightening private lives are living calmly among us, hidden behind the same small talk we use every day? Dennis Nilsen's crimes are terrifying, not only for what he did, but for how ordinary he seemed while doing it. The discovery that a home, a routine, and even the plumbing can hide such horrors leaves a lasting unease about appearances. Be watchful, not paranoid, but present. If something smells wrong in your building, push beyond polite assumptions. And if this story landed with you, please subscribe.